July 1324. The streets smell like spice and camel dung and hot stone baking under the summer sun. This is the greatest city in the world. 1 million people. Merchants from Morocco, scholars from Persia, traders from Venice. All of them packed into the golden, chaotic, magnificent heart of civilization. And right now something is very, very wrong. The price of gold is falling. Not slowly, not gently. It is crashing, like a stone dropped from a minaret, and nobody in Cairo can explain why. It isn't war. There's no flood, no plague, no disaster. It's a man. He arrived from the south, from somewhere below the great desert. Nobody in Cairo has ever seen anything like what arrived with him. 60,000 people. 60,000. Servants dressed in silk and brocade. Soldiers with copper helmets that flash like fire in the sun. 500 men walking ahead of him, just walking, and every single one of them is holding a golden staff, not painted gold, not gold-colored, solid gold. Each staff weighs almost 3 kilograms. And behind them, 100 camels, each one carrying over 100 kilograms of gold dust. He's not a merchant. He's not selling anything. He doesn't need to sell anything. He is giving it away. To officials, to strangers, to beggars in the street, to anyone who crosses his path. Every mosque he visits, he leaves gold. Every poor man who approaches him, he leaves gold. He buys things from market sellers and pays 10 times what they're worth, not because he doesn't know the price, but because he simply doesn't care. His name is Mansa Musa. He is a king. He is a pilgrim. He is the most powerful man most people in Cairo have never heard of. And by the time he leaves Egypt, he will have accidentally done something no army, no weapon, no natural disaster has ever managed to do to the greatest city in the world. He will have broken its economy. The gold market in Cairo will not fully recover for 12 years. This is his story. Before we can understand Mansa Musa, we need to understand the world he was born into, because it was a world that most people today have never been taught about. Imagine a map of Africa. Now look at the western part, the great bulge that sticks out toward the Atlantic Ocean. That is West Africa. And in the year 1300, that region was home to the most powerful, the most sophisticated, and the wealthiest civilization most of your teachers never told you about. It was called the Mali Empire. Mali, say it. Short, sharp. A name that once made merchants in Cairo sit up straighter, made scholars in Morocco sharpen their pens, and made kings across the Mediterranean wonder how one empire could possibly own that much gold. The Mali Empire sat just south of the Sahara Desert, the largest desert in the world, that ocean of sand and rock and silence that stretches across the entire top of Africa. To the north, the Sahara. To the south and west, the deep forests and the great rivers. And right in the middle, threading through the land like a liquid highway, the Niger River, one of the longest rivers in Africa, teeming with fish and merchants and flat-bottomed canoes loaded with goods. The people of this empire were called the Mandinka, or Malinka, a group of clans and families who spoke related languages, shared customs and traditions, and had been living along the upper Niger River for centuries. They grew crops, millet, rice, sorghum. They kept cattle. They traded. They built cities. But what made the Mali Empire extraordinary, what made it the richest civilization in the medieval world, was what lay beneath its soil. Gold, not just a little gold, not just enough gold to make jewelry or coins. We're talking about two of the greatest gold-producing regions on the planet, sitting right inside the empire's borders. The Bambouk goldfields between two great rivers in the west. The Boré goldfields near the upper Niger in the east. More gold than any other place in the medieval world. And the emperor, the man they called the Mansa, which means King of Kings, owned all of it. By law, every gold nugget found anywhere in the empire belonged to him personally. Only the gold dust, the tiny flakes left over from mining, could be freely traded. This wasn't greed. It was brilliance. It kept the gold from flooding the market and losing its value. The Mansa was, essentially, the world's first gold central banker. The Mali Empire controlled roughly 2/3 of all the gold circulating in the entire medieval Mediterranean world. Every gold coin in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, there's a decent chance the metal in it came from Mali. And gold wasn't the only treasure. From the north, across the Sahara, came salt, mined at a place called Tagaza, deep in the desert, where the buildings were literally made of salt blocks because there was nothing else available. Salt was so precious in the medieval world that it was sometimes traded pound for pound with gold. It preserved food. It kept armies alive. The trade routes connecting the gold fields in the south to the salt mines in the north, and then onward across the Sahara to the great cities of North Africa, these were the veins of the empire. Controlling them meant controlling the wealth of an entire continent. And at the center of all of it sat the Keita dynasty, a family whose story begins not with gold, but with a little boy who couldn't walk. Every great empire has a founder. Every dynasty has an origin story. And the origin story of the Mali Empire is so extraordinary, so cinematic, so genuinely mythic, that griots, the great storytellers and historians of West Africa, have been telling it out loud for nearly 800 years. Here's what they say. Around the year 1217, in a small kingdom called Kangaba, on the western bank of the Niger River, a baby was born to a woman named Sogolon Konde. His father was Nare Magan Konate, the local king. They named the baby Sundiata Keita. And from the very beginning, this child seemed wrong. While other boys ran and wrestled and chased goats through the village, Sundiata could not stand up. He could not walk. He crawled on all fours, dragging himself through the dust, while courtiers whispered that he would never amount to anything. A prince who couldn't even stand. What kind of king would that be? There was a sorcerer king to the north, a man named Sumaoro Kante, the ruler of the powerful Soso Empire. He was already tearing through West Africa, conquering every kingdom in his path. He had already killed 11 of the Keita king's sons. When he heard about Sundiata, this weak, crawling child, he didn't even bother to kill him. That was his first mistake. Sumaoro Kante was so feared that oral tradition says he wore shoes made from human skin and kept the skulls of defeated kings on the walls of his throne room. Whether this is literally true or a storyteller's flourish to show how evil he was, the point is clear. This was not a man who showed mercy. According to the great epic of Sundiata, which West African griots still recite today, the day came when the boy was around 7 years old. His mother had been mocked by the court. Sumaoro's agents were threatening the family, and something in Sundiata snapped. He asked for an iron rod. They brought it to him. He grabbed it with both hands and pulled himself upright. The iron rod bent under his weight. They say the muscles in his arms shook like a tree in a storm. And then, for the first time in his life, Sundiata Keita stood on his own 2 feet. He looked around at the court that had mocked him, and he walked. Sumaoro looked at this child and saw nothing. He let him live. It was the last mistake the Soso dynasty ever made. Sundiata was driven into exile after his father died, hunted from kingdom to kingdom by Sumaoro's agents. He wandered for years, from court to court, growing taller and stronger and angrier. And everywhere he went, he gathered people, generals, hunters, blacksmiths, warriors from a dozen clans who had all been beaten down by Sumaoro and were ready for someone to lead them back up. He even had help from inside the enemy palace. His own sister, Nana Triben, had been married off to Sumaoro as a political hostage. She smuggled out the secret of her husband's one weakness, a white rooster's spur. According to the epic, Sundiata tipped an arrow with it. Around 1235, at a place called the Battle of Kirina, the two forces met. Sundiata's army, a coalition that cut across clans and castes and languages, faced the Soso war machine. The Soso broke. Sumaoro fled into the mountains. The griots say he was never seen again, transformed into stone, swallowed by the mountain itself. Sundiata Keita, the boy who couldn't walk, had just won the most important battle in West African history. He took the title Mansa. He established his capital at Niani on the upper Niger. He united the kingdoms that would become the Mali Empire. And then, this is the part that doesn't get told enough, he did something even more remarkable than the conquest. He called the chiefs of every clan together at a place called the Plain of Kurukanfuga, and together they created something that oral tradition remembers as the Mandan Charter, a set of principles for how this new empire would be run. It spoke of social peace between different peoples. It declared that no human being's dignity should be violated. It addressed food security, freedom of expression, education. Some historians have called the Mandan Charter one of the earliest human rights documents in history. created before the Magna Carta became widely applied in England, at a time when most of Europe was still organized around feudal lords who owned everything and everyone. Sundiata died around 1255. How he died is a mystery. Oral tradition says he drowned in the Sankarani River, though some accounts say an arrow, others say assassination. His story was already legend before the body was cold. But here's why it matters to the story of Mansa Musa. Sundiata didn't just build an empire. He built a system, a web of provincial governors and trade networks and military units strong enough to survive bad rulers. When weak kings came after him, and they did, the empire held anyway. Because the machine Sundiata built was bigger than any single man, even the remarkable man who was coming next. Now we arrive at Musa himself, and here history gets a little quiet. The truth is, we don't know very much about Mansa Musa's childhood. His exact birth year is uncertain. Historians estimate around 1280. His mother's name is believed to have been Kanku, which is why he is sometimes called Kankan Musa, though very little was written down about her life. His father was Fagaleh, a grandson of Abu Bakr, who was the brother of Sundiata Keita himself. So Musa was royalty. Deeply, genuinely royalty, connected directly to the founder of the empire. But being connected to the founder doesn't automatically make you emperor. The Mali Empire didn't always pass the throne from father to son. Sometimes it went to brothers, sometimes to nephews. The line of succession was complicated, contested, and occasionally decided by whoever had the most supporters, or the sharpest sword. So what was young Musa's childhood like? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine it. You are growing up in Niani, the capital of the Mali Empire. The city sits near the junction of the Niger and Sankarani rivers. The palace is a complex of mud brick buildings, thick walls that keep out the brutal heat, multiple rooms, a royal stable, courtyards where griots perform and governors report. The smell of cooking fires and river water mixes with the smell of horse and leather and dust. You are a prince, but not the prince. You have cousins and uncles who are closer to the throne. You attend the royal court, sitting near the back, watching the Mansa receive visitors, listening to the reports from governors of the empire's 14 provinces, watching the legal disputes get argued out in the shade of a royal canopy. You are learning everything about how to run an empire. You just don't know yet whether you'll ever get the chance to use it. The Mali Empire that Musa grew up in was immense and complex. It wasn't just one people. It was a kaleidoscope of languages and customs and traditions, united by trade, by the authority of the Mansa, and by the growing influence of Islam. The Keita dynasty had embraced Islam, and the faith was spreading through the empire's cities and trade routes. Scholars came from Morocco and Egypt to study and teach. Arabic, the language of the Quran and of international trade, was spoken alongside Manding in the courts and universities. The Mali Empire in Musa's time covered an area roughly the size of Western Europe, stretching from the Atlantic coast of what is now Senegal all the way east to the bend of the Niger River, and from the edge of the Sahara south toward the great tropical forests. It was larger than every European kingdom of the era combined. As a young man, Musa became what was called a Kankoro Sigwi, something like a deputy or a lieutenant, in the court of the reigning Mansa. He was being prepared, educated, watched. He learned Arabic. He studied Islamic law and scholarship. He learned how the empire's trade networks worked, how the gold miners in the south operated, how the provincial governors kept order. He was patient. He was observant. He was by all accounts deeply, genuinely devout. His faith in Islam was not just political performance, it was real. And then came the day that changed everything. A day when the emperor decided to do something so extraordinary, so recklessly bold, that it would put Musa on the throne of the greatest empire in the world. The Mansa before Musa was a man named Muhammad, sometimes called Abu Bakr II, and he had an obsession: the ocean. Not the Mediterranean, which his merchants sailed regularly. The other ocean, the one to the west, the one nobody had ever fully explored, the Atlantic. Think about that for a moment. This was around the year 1311. Christopher Columbus wouldn't sail west until 1492, nearly 200 years later. The idea that there might be land across the Western Sea was hypothetical, unknown, terrifying and magnificent in equal measure. Mansa Muhammad wanted to find it. He ordered 200 ships built and loaded with men, food, and water. He gave them their orders: sail west. Don't come back until you reach the end of the ocean or until you run out of supplies. Most of those ships never came back. One returned. Just one. The captain sailed his battered vessel back into the harbor and reported to the Mansa. There was a current in the open sea, like a great river in the middle of the ocean. The other ships had gone into it. He had turned back. He didn't know what happened to the others. Mansa Muhammad didn't believe him, or rather, he didn't find the report satisfying. He wanted more. So he ordered a second fleet. Not 200 ships this time. 2,000. 1,000 for soldiers and explorers. 1,000 more loaded with supplies, food, water, rope. And this time, Mansa Muhammad himself would lead the expedition. He would not stay safely on shore and wait. Before he sailed, he needed someone to govern the empire while he was gone, someone he trusted absolutely. He chose his nephew Musa, and then Mansa Muhammad climbed aboard his ship, sailed out into the Atlantic Ocean, and was never seen again. No ship returned, no wreckage, no survivor. 2,000 vessels disappeared into the sea, and the man who sent them with them. When Musa later told this story to an Egyptian official named Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn Amir Hajib, who wrote it down, he explained his predecessor's thinking in a single sentence. The king did not believe that it was impossible to discover the furthest limit of the Atlantic Ocean, and wished vehemently to do so. He was driven by curiosity, by ambition, by the same desire to know what's over the horizon that has launched every voyage of exploration in human history. We will never know what happened to those 2,000 ships. Some historians have speculated that at least some of the fleet might have reached the coast of South America, using the same Atlantic currents that Columbus would later exploit. Others believe they were lost in storms or starved in the open water. The truth is, we simply don't know. One of history's great unanswered questions. What we do know is what happened in the Mali Empire when the fleet didn't return. Musa was Mansa. The deputy had become the king. He came to power around 1312. He was roughly 32 years old, and he had just inherited the greatest empire in the medieval world. How do you step into a role that big? How do you walk into a throne room that belongs to a man who sailed into the sea and sit down and say, "I'm in charge now"? Musa had been watching for years. He knew every province, every governor, every trade route. He had been learning in the shadows of others his whole life. Now there were no shadows, only the throne, and it was time to find out what kind of king he was. Here is the part of the story where most people think they know what happened. Musa became Mansa. He was very, very rich. He went on a pilgrimage and gave away a lot of gold. But that is like saying Sundiata Keita had some trouble walking as a child. Technically true, and entirely missing the point. The first years of Musa's reign, roughly 1312 to 1324, were 12 years of extraordinary, methodical, often brilliant governing. And they tell us something essential about who this man actually was. First, the wealth. Let's make this concrete for a moment. The Mali Empire's gold didn't just exist, it had to be extracted, controlled, taxed, and protected. The mining operations in the Bambouk and Bouré goldfields employed thousands of people. The miners dug the gold. They kept the gold dust, tiny flakes that could be traded freely. But every gold nugget, every solid lump, went to the Mansa, by law, always. This wasn't an accident. The kings of Mali had figured out something that most medieval governments never managed. If you let too much gold into circulation too quickly, it loses its value. So they held the nuggets, releasing them slowly, maintaining the price. The Mansa was essentially running the world's first gold reserve policy. On top of the gold, there was the salt trade. Salt came from the mines at Taghaza, a surreal place deep in the Sahara where the ground itself was salt, where the buildings were built from salt blocks because there was nothing else. A load of salt cost 8 to 10 gold coins in the desert. That same load, by the time it reached the capital at Niani, cost 20 to 40. The Mansa taxed every transaction. And then there were the trade routes themselves, the long caravan trails connecting the gold fields in the south to the markets of Morocco and Egypt in the north. Every caravan that passed through Mali paid taxes. Every merchant who traded in Malian markets paid taxes. Musa had customs officers, judges, and administrators stationed across the empire. He also had, and this is important, an army, roughly 100,000 soldiers, 10,000 cavalry on armored horses, wearing copper helmets and chainmail, carrying swords and spears, elite units called the Farimba, comparable to medieval knights, river clans who could move troops rapidly across the Niger and its tributaries. Some historians estimate that Musa's army was the third largest fighting force in the world at the time, after China and the successor states of the Mongol Empire. In a single human lifetime, a family that had once been a minor chieftaincy on the Niger had built a military machine that rivaled anything on the planet. But Musa didn't want to rule through fear. He wanted to rule through something more durable, loyalty. In the early years of his reign, word reached him that gold miners in the south were unhappy. Musa had issued a decree telling them to stop certain traditional religious practices. He was trying to spread Islam throughout the empire. The miners pushed back. They stopped working. This was a crisis. The entire wealth of the empire depended on those mines producing gold. Musa had two options. He could send his army to force the miners back to work, or he reversed the decree. He publicly admitted he had gotten it wrong. He withdrew the order. The miners went back to work. And by showing that the king could change his mind, that being right mattered more than looking strong, Musa gained something more valuable than the gold those miners dug. He gained their respect. He also dealt with bandits who plagued the trade routes. Under previous Mansas, armed gangs had made travel across the empire dangerous, scaring off merchants and cutting into tax revenue. Musa introduced strict enforcement. Anyone caught robbing travelers was severely punished. The roads became safe. Merchants came from farther away. Trade boomed. By the time Ibn Battuta visited the Mali Empire decades later, he recorded something remarkable. A woman could travel alone from one end of the empire to the other, carrying gold, and no one would dare touch her. That was the legacy of Musa's security policy. He also did something no previous Mansa had done. He began sending students to Morocco to study at the great universities there, universities connected to the intellectual ferment of Muslim Spain, which was then one of the most advanced centers of learning in the world. He was importing knowledge, investing in his own people's minds. The empire was growing, not just in wealth, but in sophistication. Cities hummed, caravans moved, scholars debated, and in the palace at Niani, Musa sat on his black ebony throne between two great elephant tusks and governed 14 provinces, each with its own administrator, each contributing to the richest government treasury in the medieval world. But something was missing. Musa was a deeply religious man, and as a Muslim, as someone who believed in the 5 pillars of Islam, there was one thing he knew he was called to do. One obligation he had not yet fulfilled. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And when Mansa Musa decided to go on a pilgrimage, he was going to do it in a way that the world would still be talking about 700 years later. In Islam, the Hajj is one of the 5 great duties of the faith, alongside prayer, fasting, giving to the poor, and declaring belief in God. Every Muslim who is physically able and financially capable is required, at least once in their lifetime, to make the journey to Mecca, the holy city in what is now Saudi Arabia, where the Prophet Muhammad received the word of God, where the great black stone called the Kaaba sits at the center of the world's largest mosque. Musa had been planning his Hajj for years. Now you might think, a king going on a pilgrimage is a king taking a vacation, a private spiritual trip. That is not how Mansa Musa operated. For Musa, the Hajj was 3 things at once. It was a genuine act of faith. He was a deeply devout man who truly wanted to stand before the Kaaba and fulfill his religious duty. It was also a diplomatic mission, a chance to meet the rulers of Egypt, to be seen by the scholars and merchants who networked along the pilgrim routes, to show the world what the Mali Empire was. And it was a statement, a way of saying to every city and court he passed through, "Look at us, look at what we have built. Look at the power of the empire from below the Sahara." The preparation took years and probably consumed a significant portion of the empire's surplus wealth. Think about the logistics for a moment. 60,000 people. That's not an exaggeration. That comes from Arab historians who interviewed Egyptian eyewitnesses. 60,000. That includes 12,000 personal servants dressed in silk and brocade, 8,000 soldiers, family members, governors and officials who wanted to be part of the great journey, workers and cooks and craftspeople. 500 selected servants would walk ahead of Musa himself, each carrying a golden staff weighing about 2 kilograms. They were a visual announcement. The king is coming. 100 camels, each carrying over 100 kilograms of gold. That's roughly 12,000 kilograms of gold, 12 tons, just in this part of the caravan alone. How do you feed 60,000 people across the Sahara Desert? How do you provide water? How do you keep that many people moving in the same direction across thousands of kilometers of terrain that ranges from hot savanna to burning desert to the hills of Arabia? Obsessively, for years, Musa left his son Magan in charge as regent. He appointed trusted administrators. He put the empire in order. He checked the roads and the wells and the water sources. He arranged for supplies to be waiting at stopping points along the route. And then, in 1324, he rode out of Niani on a black stallion with gold trappings, wearing wide trousers made from a rich fabric reserved for royalty, with the crowds cheering him farewell. The greatest journey in medieval history had begun. Imagine you are there. It is dawn on the savannah, somewhere south of the Sahara. The air is still cool, carrying the smell of red dust and dry grass and animal. Behind you, the caravan stretches back so far you cannot see where it ends. Ahead of you, the horizon is turning from black to deep purple to orange. You are somewhere in the middle of 60,000 people. There are camels everywhere. That impossible, alien, magnificent sound of several hundred camels moving, their broad feet padding on the earth, their low groans as they carry their loads. There are horses. Musa himself is far ahead, occasionally peeling off with his guards to ride parallel to the main column, watching for anything interesting, curious as a child, powerful as a god. Cooks are already working. Fires, the smell of food. Musicians are playing somewhere. The empire has brought its griots, its performers, its entertainers, because even on a desert crossing, the Mansa does not travel in silence. And there is gold everywhere you look, on the staffs of the 500, in the dust that occasionally puffs up from the pack saddles of the camels, in the jewelry of the servants and officials and family members. It catches the morning light and turns everything golden. You are not going on a journey, you are going on an event. The route ran from Niani northward through Walata, a major trading city in what is now Mauritania, and then into the Sahara proper, past Taghaza, the salt mine city where the buildings are made of salt, through the Algerian desert, and finally, after months of travel through terrain that swings between 58 degrees Celsius in the day and below freezing at night, the caravan descended into the Nile Valley. Cairo. Musa entered the greatest city in the world in July of 1324. He rode through the western gate on his black stallion, dressed in full regalia, surrounded by his golden-staffed servants, as the crowds of Cairo parted around him and stared. The Egyptian official who met him reportedly compared the caravan to the glittering glory of the African sun itself. The ruling Sultan of Egypt, Al-Nasir Muhammad, one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world, invited Musa to a formal audience at court. And here is where Mansa Musa did something extraordinary. He refused to kneel. In medieval court protocol, visiting rulers were expected to prostrate themselves before the Sultan, to bow down, touch the ground, acknowledge his supremacy. It was a gesture of submission. Musa refused. His advisors worked frantically behind the scenes. Diplomatic disaster loomed. Finally, a compromise was found. Musa would bow, but he would bow to God, not to the Sultan. He kissed the ground and praised Allah. When he finally entered the audience chamber, he reportedly said, "I bow only to God." Al-Nasir received him as an equal. It was the first time the court of the most powerful Muslim state in the world had extended that recognition to a ruler from sub-Saharan Africa, and Musa had demanded it, not by force, but by refusing to accept anything less. The two rulers feasted, gifts were exchanged. The caravan was hosted in the Karafa district of the city, where Musa befriended a governor named Ibn Amir Hajib, who would later write down the story of the lost Atlantic fleet, and Musa began giving away gold. Can you imagine being so rich that just showing up somewhere broke the economy? Not damaged it. not cause some inconvenience, completely, thoroughly, catastrophically broke it for 12 years. This is what happened. Musa didn't come to Cairo to trade. He came to pass through on his way to Mecca. But while he was there, staying for roughly 3 months to let the summer heat pass before continuing, he did what he always did. He gave gold to every official who received him. He gave gold to the poor. He bought things in the market at 3, 4, 5 times their actual price, not because he was foolish, but because he genuinely did not care. He had more gold than he could possibly count. What did the price of a bolt of cloth matter? He gave gold to every mosque he visited. He gave gold to scholars. He gave gold to beggars. He commissioned buildings. He tipped lavishly at every stop. And then he did it again and again and again. The Arab historian Al-Umari, writing around 1340, just a few years after these events, interviewed people who had witnessed the visit and reported what happened next. The gold market in Cairo collapsed. Here is why. Gold is valuable because it is rare. The less of it there is, the more each piece is worth. When Musa arrived with 12 tons of gold and started distributing it freely, suddenly there was far more gold in Cairo than there had been. The supply went up, dramatically, rapidly, overwhelming the market. And when supply goes up, price goes down. The value of the Egyptian gold coin, the dinar, fell by 6 of its smaller units, called dirhams. That doesn't sound enormous until you realize that the dinar was the backbone of trade across the entire Mediterranean world. When the dinar fell in value, every merchant in Cairo who had been holding gold as savings suddenly found their savings were worth less. Every contract written in gold terms needed to be renegotiated. Every price in every market had to shift. The shock rippled outward. Merchants in Morocco felt it. Traders in Arabia felt it. European merchants who dealt with Egyptian gold dealers felt it. Cairo's gold market did not fully recover for 12 years after Musa's visit. One single person, one man being generous during a 3-month stay, caused more economic disruption than most wars of the era. Now, here is the part that makes this story almost funny, if you think about it the right way. Musa realized what he had done. At some point during his stay in Cairo, or perhaps on the return journey, the scale of the damage he had caused became clear to him. He had gone to Egypt as a humble pilgrim, giving blessings to the poor and gifts to the faithful, and he had accidentally hurt the very people he was trying to bless. The gold he had given away so joyfully had reduced the value of everyone else's gold. So he tried to fix it. He borrowed gold back from Cairo's moneylenders at interest rates, high, extortionate interest rates, the kind you pay when lenders know you desperately need the money. For every 300 coins he borrowed, he eventually had to pay back 700. Think about that. The richest man in the world, a man with 12 tons of gold in his caravan, had to take out a loan in Cairo because he had given too much of his gold away. He borrowed money to soak up the gold he had just given away, trying to remove it from circulation and restore the market price. It is, hands down, the most extraordinary economic accident in medieval history, and Musa's response to it, actually trying to fix it, even at personal financial cost, tells us something important about his character. He didn't just shrug and ride away. He tried to clean up his own mess. The Arab historian who recorded this described it as the only known case of a medieval ruler attempting to perform monetary policy on a foreign economy he had accidentally destabilized. He was, in a very real sense, the world's first accidental international central banker. The caravan left Cairo on the 18th of October, 1324. They crossed the desert between the Nile and the Red Sea, reached the Gulf of Suez, and stepped for the first time onto the continent of Asia. Along the road, trade routes from 3 continents converged. Asian merchants, European pilgrims, African royalty, all moving together toward the holy city. Musa was fascinated. He spoke to everyone. He asked questions. He listened to scholars and merchants and fellow pilgrims with the same intense curiosity that had made him such an effective governor. He was learning. They stopped at Medina first, the second holiest city in Islam, where the Prophet Muhammad was buried. Musa visited the Prophet's mosque and stood in the place where Islam had taken its first steps in the world. And then, after traveling another 240 miles south along the Arabian Peninsula, the caravan drawn out in long segments through the rugged desert hills. Musa saw it, the Kaaba. In the center of the great mosque of Mecca, there is a structure, roughly the size of a large room, draped in black cloth, embroidered in gold. It is called the Kaaba, the house of God. Muslims around the world face toward it when they pray, 5 times a day, every day of their lives. It is the spiritual center of the Islamic world. And Mansa Musa, the most powerful ruler in sub-Saharan Africa, the man who had just crashed the economy of Cairo, who commanded 100,000 soldiers and 12 tons of gold, took off his jewelry. He took off the symbols of his rank. He put on a simple white garment, the same garment worn by every other pilgrim. And he became for 12 days not a king, just a man. He walked the circuits of the Kaaba with thousands of other pilgrims. He climbed the Mount of Mercy on the 9th day, as tradition required. He prayed. He fasted. He performed the rituals that have been performed in Mecca since the time of the Prophet. The white garment is the point. In the Hajj, there is no king and no beggar, no rich and no poor. Every pilgrim wears the same plain cloth. Every pilgrim is equal before God. For a man who had spent years surrounded by wealth and power and ceremony, there is something in this that must have reached very deep. At some point, during the Hajj, Musa reportedly told those around him that he wanted to stay in Mecca, that he wanted to live out his days here, in this city, this close to God. But news reached him from home. His son Magan was struggling as regent. There was trouble in the empire. The Songhai people to the east were restless. The empire needed its king. Musa had one more thing to do before he left. He needed to find an architect, the man from Andalusia. His name was Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, and he was by most accounts a poet. Not a king, not a general, not a wealthy merchant. A poet and architect from the city of Granada in Andalusia, the Muslim-ruled region of Spain that was then one of the most intellectually brilliant places in the world. A meeting place of Arabic, European, and African ideas, where astronomers and mathematicians and musicians and architects worked side by side. Musa met him in Mecca. They talked. They became friends. The kind of fast, electric friendship that happens between people who recognize something in each other. Musa asked him to come back to Mali. Al-Sahili agreed. This friendship between an emperor and a poet born on the steps of the Kaaba was about to change the face of an entire continent. But we'll get there. First, the return journey. The caravan began moving back toward Cairo, and somewhere on the road, a messenger arrived with extraordinary news. One of Musa's generals, Sagmanja, had captured the city of Gao, the great city of the Songhai Empire, on the bend of the Niger River. Musa made a decision. He changed the route. Instead of heading directly home, he swung south toward Gao. He would receive the surrender himself. He would be there in person when this great prize joined the Mali Empire. When the people of Gao saw the caravan coming, thousands upon thousands of people, the golden staffs catching the desert light, the Mansa on his black stallion at the center, they understood what was happening. This was not negotiation. This was the empire. Musa received the submission respectfully. He didn't gloat. He didn't destroy. He let the defeated king keep running local affairs. He simply established that Mali now controlled military and foreign policy, and that tribute would flow to Niani. As was typical of him, he was horrified by the local mosque. It had a straw roof. He immediately commissioned a new one, built in a style that had never been seen in this part of Africa. Sun-dried brick, thick walls to keep out the heat, an architectural language that blended Malian and Andalusian sensibilities. He was already working. Then the caravan moved further west, following the great bend of the Niger River, and Musa saw Timbuktu for the first time as its new ruler. Imagine you are there again. It is around 1325. You are approaching Timbuktu from the east, following the Niger River. The water is high, it's flood season, and the river has swollen wide and brown and powerful, with flat-bottomed canoes moving up and down its surface, carrying goods and people. On the northern bank, the city appears. It isn't the biggest city you've ever seen. Niani is probably bigger. Cairo is certainly bigger. But there is something about Timbuktu that is different. It sits at a crossroads, the place where the Niger River's navigable reach ends and the Sahara Desert begins. It is the point where the north and south meet, where river trade and desert trade interlock. Merchants from Morocco arrive here with salt and horses and copper, and meet merchants from the south with gold and kola nuts and cotton. The air smells like dried fish and spice and animal and dust. The streets are busy in a particular way that says this is a place where business happens. And then you see the mosque, and you understand why Musa brought an architect from Andalusia. The Djinguereber Mosque took shape over the following years under Al-Sahili's direction. It rose from the earth of Timbuktu like something grown rather than built, because in a very real sense it was. The walls were made of mud brick, the surface roughened by wooden beams that projected from the sides so that workers could climb up and replaster the walls after each rainy season. The minarets rose above the city like fingers pointing at the sky. Inside, 3 courtyards could hold 2,000 worshippers. It still stands, today, in the 21st century. 800 years after Musa commissioned it, people still pray in the Djinguereber Mosque of Timbuktu. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The building that Musa built hasn't fallen down. And he wasn't done. The Sankor Mosque, which had existed earlier under the patronage of a wealthy Mandinka woman, was expanded and reorganized into a full madrasa, a school of Islamic learning. Musa staffed it with jurists who understood Islamic law, astronomers who could calculate prayer times and track the movements of the stars, mathematicians, historians. He built a palace for himself using Andalusian architects. He invested in the city's infrastructure. Scholars began arriving, from Fez in Morocco, from Cairo, from Andalusia. They brought their books, manuscripts on theology, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, history, poetry. Libraries grew. Students came to study. The University of Sankore became, over the following generations, one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world. At its peak, under Musa's influence and those who came after him, Timbuktu may have had as many as 180 Quranic schools and a community of scholars with access to hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. When jihadists destroyed part of the Ahmed Baba Institute in 2012, local librarians had already secretly moved hundreds of thousands of those manuscripts to safety in Bamako, loading them onto trucks and boats in the middle of the night, protecting Musa's intellectual legacy with their lives. Timbuktu was not just a city anymore. Under Musa, it became an idea, proof that Africa was a place of knowledge and sophistication and civilization at a time when much of Europe was quite literally living in mud. Musa returned to Niani in triumph, and what he did next was just as extraordinary as everything that had come before. He built the Hall of Audience at the capital, a soaring structure adorned with arabesques in rich, bold colors, gold window frames, cut stone, an impressive dome. Italian and Arab visitors who came to Niani in the years after his return wrote about the 400 cities of the Mali Empire, of their dense populations, their prosperity, their order. He built mosques in cities across the empire that doubled as schools, small centers of learning, spreading literacy and religious knowledge into communities that had never had formal education before. He expanded the diplomatic network, maintaining relations with Morocco, with Egypt, with the sultanates of North Africa. Ambassadors came to Niani. The Mali Empire was no longer a distant rumor on the far side of the Sahara. It was a player on the world stage, a recognized power. He dealt quietly with the awkward question that kept arising from foreign rulers who wanted to know, where exactly does all this gold come from? Musa had a favorite answer. He told visitors that the gold grew on plants in a corner of his empire, and that people with special powers protected it, and that any outsider who tried to pick those plants would cause them to wither and die. This was, of course, a polite way of saying it's none of your business, and if you try to find out, things will go badly for you. The gold mines were Mali's greatest strategic secret. No visitor was going to get a map. He also spent time preparing his son Magan for succession, knowing with some anxiety that the young man had struggled as regent during the Hajj. Musa wanted to pass power smoothly. He wanted what he had built to last. And for a time it did. The Mali Empire under Musa was, in the judgment of historians, at the absolute peak of its power, wealth, and sophistication. Trade flowed, the roads were safe, the scholars taught, the mosques stood, the gold continued to be mined and traded and controlled. In 1375, nearly 4 decades after Musa's death, a mapmaker on the island of Majorca created what historians call the Catalan Atlas, the most sophisticated world map of the Middle Ages. And at the center of West Africa, he drew a figure on a throne, wearing a crown, holding a gold nugget the size of a fist. The caption described him as the richest and most noble king in all the land. It was Mansa Musa, the first time a sub-Saharan African ruler had ever appeared on a European map. The image shaped how the outside world saw West Africa for centuries. It still does. Around 1337, Mansa Musa died. The exact cause is unknown. He was probably in his late 50s, elderly by medieval standards. He had governed for approximately 25 years. He had built an empire, broken an economy, commissioned a city, made Timbuktu a center of learning, and placed sub-Saharan Africa on the map of the world's imagination. He was probably 57 years old, give or take. He died without ever returning to Mecca, as he had once dreamed. He left behind a difficult inheritance. The succession question tells us something important. In the Mali Empire, the throne didn't always pass from father to son. It often went to brothers or nephews. Musa chose to break with that tradition. He chose his son Magan to succeed him. Magan lasted 4 years. He was not a strong ruler. The Songhai Empire began pushing back against Malian control. Raiding parties from the Mossi people terrorized Timbuktu. The careful security that Musa had spent years building started to erode. When Magan died, his uncle, Musa's brother Suleiman, took the throne, and Suleiman was, it must be said, a capable ruler. He held the empire together for nearly 2 decades. He maintained diplomatic relations with Morocco and Egypt. He kept the trade routes functioning. But he was also apparently a rather ungenerous host. In 1352, the great Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta arrived at the Malian court. He was the most famous traveler of the medieval world. He had been to India, to China, to Russia, to almost everywhere, and he was expecting to be received in style. Instead, Suleiman's welcome gift consisted of 3 cakes of bread, a piece of fried beef, and a calabash of sour milk. Ibn Battuta wrote, "When I saw it, I laughed." He called Suleiman a miserly king. Ibn Battuta's account is one of the most detailed eyewitness descriptions of the Mali Empire that survives, and it was written by a man who was furious about the quality of his welcome meal. But even a miserly Suleiman could see what his brother had built. He recorded the security of the roads, how a person could travel the length of the empire alone without fear. He described the strict observance of prayer and law. He wrote about the king's ceremonial court, the silk canopy, the golden falcon on top, the 300-man armed bodyguard. The Mali Empire was still magnificent, but after Suleiman died around 1360, the slow unraveling began. His son lasted 9 months before a civil war. Then came a ruler named Mari Jata II, who Ibn Khaldun described as so reckless that he actually sold pieces of the royal regalia, including a massive gold nugget that had been passed from Mansa to Mansa as a symbol of sovereignty for generations. The man who sold the nugget sold the dynasty's credibility with it. Provincial governors stopped obeying. Tributary states stopped paying tribute. The great machine Sundiata had built, the one that had survived mediocre rulers for over a century, had finally encountered rulers so weak that even the machine couldn't compensate. The losses came in sequence, like candles going out. In the 1430s, the Tuareg nomads of the Sahara captured Timbuktu, the city Musa had built, the university he had funded, the mosque that still stood. 3 years later, Walata fell. In 1468, the rising Songhai Empire under a warrior king named Sunni Ali took Timbuktu back from the Tuareg, but not to restore it to Mali. The age of Songhai had begun, and the Tariq al-Sudan, a great historical chronicle of the region, records what happened when Sunni Ali entered. He committed gross iniquity, burned parts of the city, brutally treated its scholars. The scholars of Sankor loaded 1,000 camels with books and fled. 1,000 camels, with books, fleeing for their lives, carrying the intellectual inheritance of the civilization Musa had built. By 1599, what remained of the Mali Empire was a small rump state on the upper Niger. The last Mansa, Mahmud Keita IV, attacked a city hoping to reclaim something of what had been lost. He was driven back by Moroccan musketeers who had crossed the Sahara with gunpowder weapons, technology that changed everything and that the old empire had no answer for. Around 1610, Mahmud died. Oral tradition says his 3 sons fought over what was left. What was left was almost nothing. The Keita family retreated to Kangaba, the same small village on the upper Niger where, nearly 4 centuries earlier, the whole story had begun. Chapter 14, The Story That Will Not Die. Let's talk about the number. You may have heard that Mansa Musa was worth $400 billion, making him the richest person who ever lived, richer than Elon Musk, richer than Jeff Bezos, richer than John D. Rockefeller, or any king or conqueror in human history. Here's the honest truth. We don't know. The $400 billion figure is a modern estimate, an attempt by economists to calculate what Mali's gold reserves would be worth in today's money. It involves a lot of assumptions, a lot of guesswork, and it is not a bank statement. Musa himself never counted his wealth. No one did. The sources we have, Arab historians, oral traditions, European accounts, all agree that he was staggeringly wealthy, beyond anything their contemporaries could imagine. But the most powerful evidence for Musa's wealth isn't a number. It's the thing that actually happened. He gave away gold in Cairo for 3 months, and the gold market didn't fully recover for 12 years. A number can be disputed. That fact cannot. What we know for certain, Musa was real. His empire was real. His pilgrimage was real. His generosity was real. His buildings still stand. His university produced real scholars whose manuscripts still exist in libraries in Bamako and Timbuktu. And his legacy is real. In the village of Kangaba, on the upper Niger River, about 90 kilometers southwest of Bamako, the modern capital of the nation called Mali, there stands a circular mud-walled structure called the Kama Blon, the House of Speech. It was built in 1653, a few decades after the last Keita emperor died. Every 7 years, the Keita family and the Diabete griots, the hereditary storytellers of the dynasty, gather at this hut. They repair the roof, and on the night before the new roof goes on, the griots step inside the roofless sanctuary and recite the great story, the story of Sundiata, the story of the empire, the story of everything that was built and everything that was lost. Only the families of the Mandinka, who trace their lineage to the founding, are allowed within 15 meters of the ceremony. UNESCO inscribed it as intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2009. Documented ceremonies have been held in 1954, 1968, 1975, 1982, 1989, 1997, 2004, 2011, and 2018. The story has been told without interruption for nearly 800 years. In 2012, armed jihadists occupied Timbuktu. They destroyed ancient shrines. They smashed the sacred door of a mosque that had stood for centuries. They burned manuscripts, some of them dating back to the era of Mansa Musa himself. But a network of librarians, led by a man named Abdel Kader Haidara, had already been quietly moving the manuscripts. For years, working in secret, they had been packing ancient books into metal trunks, loading them onto trucks and boats, and smuggling them south to Bamako. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, saved from burning. The French military intervened in January 2013. The city was liberated. And in 2016, the man who ordered the burning of Timbuktu's cultural heritage was brought before the International Criminal Court, the highest court of international justice in the world. He was convicted. The burning of those ancient manuscripts was ruled a war crime. Mansa Musa died around 1337. His empire fell apart in the 1600s. But nearly 700 years after his death, the buildings he commissioned, the university he funded, the manuscripts his scholars produced, they had just set new international law. His legacy reached across 7 centuries and changed how the world defines what it means to destroy a culture, what the gold couldn't buy. Here is the thing about Mansa Musa that I keep thinking about. He had more gold than anyone in the world had ever had, an army of 100,000, an empire the size of Western Europe, the most powerful ruler in the medieval world who you've probably never heard of. And he used it to build a library. He used it to hire a poet and turn a trading post into a university. He used it to make the roads safe for travelers. He used it to stand before the holiest building in Islam and take off his crown and put on a plain white robe and become, for 12 days, just another human being searching for something larger than himself. There is something here that matters. Musa understood, instinctively, deeply, that wealth is not the point. Wealth is what you build with it. The gold was a tool. What he built with it was a civilization, a city of learning that sent scholars across Africa and the Mediterranean for 2 centuries after his death, a road network that let ordinary people travel safely, a diplomatic presence that put his empire on the world map and forced the most powerful courts in Islam to receive him as an equal. And yes, he also made mistakes. He gave away so much gold that he broke Cairo's economy and had to take out a loan at terrible interest rates to fix it. He enslaved people. The sources are clear that enslaved men and women formed part of his court and his caravan, and that after military victories, enslaved people were taken and set to work. This was the practice of the era, across Africa and Europe and everywhere else, but that doesn't make it invisible in the telling of his story. It happened. It was real. And an honest telling of his greatness includes an honest acknowledgement of its costs. But the full picture of Mansa Musa is extraordinary. He was a man who understood that the greatest currency isn't gold, it's knowledge. He went to Mecca and came back different. He brought an architect. He built schools. He funded libraries. He connected his empire to the intellectual life of the world. And then, in a village on the upper Niger River, a family started gathering every 7 years to tell the story. They are still gathering. Every 7 years, the Diabate griots stand inside the roofless Kamablon in Kangaba and speak the words they have been speaking for nearly 800 years. The story of a boy who couldn't walk, who pulled himself upright, who built an empire. The story of a man who was given the throne of that empire by a predecessor who sailed into the Atlantic and never came back. The story of a caravan of 60,000 people crossing the desert. The story of gold flooding Cairo. The story of a mosque built from mud that still stands. The story of a university that kept learning alive in Timbuktu for centuries. The empire is gone. The ceremony is not. The Catalan Atlas, drawn in 1375, shows Mansa Musa on his throne. Golden crown, golden scepter, golden nugget held in his outstretched hand. He is smiling. He is enormous, filling the center of the map, dominating the image of West Africa in the way that his empire dominated the medieval world. The atlas is kept today in the National Library of France in Paris. You can look it up. The image is exactly as described. A man who has been dead for nearly 700 years is still the largest figure on the map of Africa. Some people are remembered. Some people become myths. And a very few, the ones who built something larger than themselves, who invested not in gold but in people, who understood that what you leave behind matters more than what you hold. A very few become stories that refuse to die. The Diabate griots are speaking right now, in that mud-walled hut in Kangaba. The roof is being repaired. The story is being told. Listen,